Good evening. My name is Catherine Newmark. I work as a journalist, and I am delighted on behalf of the Allianz Kulturstiftung to welcome you here in the Maxim Gorki Theatre, a very empty theatre, as you can see. In this corona crisis, our discussion series Berliner Korrespondenzen, Berlin Correspondences, has been moved almost entirely into the digital realm. Und falls Sie sich jetzt wundern, dass ich Englisch spreche, es gibt einen synchronen deutschsprachigen Stream. Sie müssen dazu auf YouTube in der Menüspalte rechts in die andere Kamera auswählen. Berliner Korrespondenzen is a series that started in 2016. It is a cooperation between the Maxim Gorki Theatre, the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Humboldt University and the Allianz Kulturstiftung. The discussion series brings together voices from politics, sciences and culture, and it aims to make sense of the order and disorder of our radically changing world. And to analyze what then Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier called in 2016 the tectonic shifts of our present moment. Right now, though, things feel more like an earthquake than like the slow and continual and gradual continental drift. The coronavirus has changed the reality of our worlds entirely in ways that we cannot even comprehend in such a short time, and we do not even know what is going to be the case in the near, the distant, or even the medium future. So what we are trying to debate tonight, the question of what will the world look like after corona, is in a way very much something that happens in a virtual space just as much as this discussion series happens in a virtual space. We do not know what the future holds. We don't know what will happen in 3 weeks. And yet, beyond the central question that we have right now, which is to survive the pandemic, it is obviously quite important that we ask the significant questions that this pandemic poses. We have to ask what are the risks, the dangers, and also the chances of a future world after corona. What is happening to us right now, what is happening to our politics, to our societies, to our cultures, and what will happen when the pandemic has passed, and what would we like to happen? In a word, what will the world after corona look like, and what should it look like? It is these questions that I want to talk about in the next hour with my two guests, with Susan Neiman and Ivan Krastev. But before they join me, I am very honored to introduce Heiko Maas, the German Minister of Foreign Affairs, who has agreed to give a few opening remarks. He has recorded them in the studio on the roof of the Foreign Ministry, which houses an artist-in-resident program. The art that you see in the background is by the Syrian artist Ali Kauf. And so here I give you Heiko Maas.
Liebe Susan Neiman, lieber Ivan Krastev.
Dear Susan Neiman, dear Ivan Krastev, dear Ms. Newmark, dear viewers. Today we're seeing the first digital Berlin Correspondence Edition. I would like to start by extending sincere congratulations to all those who've made that possible. Shamin Langhoff, the artistic director of the Maxim Gorki Theatre. Shamin, thank you too for your engagement. Esra Küçük, the managing director of the Allianz Cultural Foundation, and of course to our team at the Federal Foreign Office. When I heard who all would be taking part in this discussion today, one thing was clear to me above all, that this edition of the Berlin Correspondences would not only particularly interesting, but also particularly lively. A perfect setup to inject life into this digital format. In a podcast with an American university a few days ago, Susan Neiman talked about how superfluous she feels as a philosopher just now when a very different group of people is keeping the world going. Doctors, nurses and care staff, lorry drivers, all the people who work in our local supermarkets. She went on to say, if I may paraphrase, that this is all the more reason why we should perhaps use this time to think about what comes afterwards, about the way out of the crisis. To my mind, that pinpoints exactly what today's Berlin Correspondence aims and claims to be doing as well. It is a matter of appreciating, of improving and shaping. Ladies and gentlemen, in the early stages of the crisis, Europe focused all its actions on countering the danger. If you wanted, you could detect national egoism there, or, like Ivan Krastev, at least a renaissance of the nation-states. Perhaps, because of my job, I see this slightly differently. After all, solidarity demands a certain degree of capacity for action on one's own part. And that's why it was right, perhaps even necessary, for countries around the world to try first to get the crisis under control at home. This produced capacities that we then used to help others. For example, when corona patients from Italy and France were treated in German hospitals. But also when we adopted by far the biggest ever aid package in the history of the EU. And this is just the beginning. The negotiations on the European Recovery Programme will be one of the focuses of our German EU presidency. By the way, for us Europeans, one thing was always clear, namely that the only way to fight a virus that knows no borders is by acting together. This applies to the EU, to the G7, international organizations like WHO, and also the Alliance for Multilateralism, which we created. We have put the fight against the pandemic, the search of vaccines, and the questions of the fair global distribution of medical equipment right at the top of every agenda. But the crisis has shown us something else. Solidarity without sovereignty risks to be exploited. So we need to make our societies more resilient, not least in the face of disinformation. The WHO is already describing the dangerous false coronavirus claims as an infodemic. We will also be focusing on this topic in Europe. To this end, we'll be getting advice not only from experts, but from citizens across Europe. And we will be asking them how they want to get information digitally and how governments and social media companies should be handled disinformation. I see this as a step towards a real European public space, which looks beyond national interests, a public space which questions the stereotypes of the poor South and the rich North, which gets involved in debates and on the future. For that, we need new forms of political dialogue and participation. That's why I'm already looking forward to a project which we're planning with Olafur Eliasson during our EU presidency. His Earth Speaker will give young people all over Europe the chance to feed their visions for the future into the public and the political arenas. I believe ideas like this are more important than ever, particularly in times of physical distance. And the further we get through the acute phase of this crisis, the louder should be the voices from the cultural, scientific, and social spheres. Voices calling for openness, diversity, democracy, and the rule of law, not simply to be left by the wayside in the crisis. This will only succeed if we act together. So let us make a start today. Thank you very much.
To Foreign Minister Heiko Maas for these words. I now will have the pleasure to introduce our guests for tonight. On my one side, or on one screen, we have Susan Neiman, an American philosopher born in Atlanta. She studied in Harvard and taught philosophy in Yale and Tel Aviv. She came to Berlin, to Germany in the year 2000, and she has been the director of the Potsdamer Einstein Forum since then. And she's, among many other functions, also a member of the board of the Allianz Kulturstiftung, who is co-organizing this event. She joins us from her flat in Berlin, Kreuzberg or Neukölln. There is some debate as to which part of Berlin she lives in. Anyway, very much welcome to Susan Neiman. And
thank you.
Susan Neiman is
officially it is Neukölln.
Known for her broad and extremely enlightening work on evil. Her book, Evil in Modern Thought, An Alternative History of Philosophy, is an extremely important read, not just for those among us who are fascinated by evil, but also for everyone who wishes to understand the dark side of Enlightenment ideals that have been so important in Europe in the last few centuries. And less than 2 months ago, already very much just at the beginning of the pandemic, Susan Neiman's most recent book was published in German. It is called Von den Deutschen lernen, wie Gesellschaften mit dem Bösen in ihrer Geschichte umgehen können. That's the German title. In English, it is Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil. And it makes a far-reaching and fascinating analysis of the different ways two societies have dealt with their past. Modern Germany with National Socialism and the United States with racism and slavery. So very much welcome to Susan Neiman in Neukölln or Kreuzköln.
Neukölln. Thank you. Glad to be here.
And on my other side, or my other screen, I have Ivan Krastev. He was born in Lukovic in Bulgaria, and he's a political scientist and analyst. He is the chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia and a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. And among many, many, many other political and academic functions, he is a founding board member of the think tank European Council on Foreign Relations. Ivan joins us from the Bulgarian-Greek border, from a country house in the south of Bulgaria, and in a very idyllic landscape, I must say. And about Ivan's work, for those who do not yet know it, it is an extremely influential political analysis that have appeared in forms of essays and commentaries and many important academic journals and mainstream media outlets. Ivan is a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, among many other things. And of course, he has also published a number of much discussed books. The most recent one appeared in November of this year in German. In English, the title is The Light That Failed. In German, it's called Das Licht, das erlosch. It is co-written with Stephen Holmes and tries to make sense of the dynamics between East and West Europe. And before that, there was the critically acclaimed essay After Europe, which appeared in 2017 in German under the title of Europadämmerung. In these works, Ivan Krastev not only explains the Eastern European experience to Western audiences, but also develops important insights into what is the current crisis of liberal democracies. And it is for his work that he is this year's recipient of the Jean Amery Award for European Essay Writing. In German, it's the Jean Amery Preis für europäische Essayistik that is awarded by the Allianz Kulturstiftung together with the publishing house Klett-Cotta. And the presentation of this award to Ivan Krastev was originally planned to take place tonight, and it had to be postponed, unfortunately, but we are delighted that we can at least speak to Ivan Krastev through the wonders of modern technology. Welcome and many congratulations.
Thank you.
So I myself, as I have said, am in the Empty Gorky Theatre in Berlin Mitte, a theatre that we are consciously trying to integrate into this debate. And the question that we want to talk about is what the world will look like after Corona as far as we can know at this point. The plan for this digital format is that we structure it into 3 main topics, which we will introduce by 3 propositions or claims, which my guests will then debate. It's supposed to last for about 60 minutes, and this is a format that we will want to repeat in the next few months. The Gorky Theatre and the Allianz Kulturstiftung will continue to do digital Berliner Korrespondenzen. Now let's, without further ado, enter into the first topic of debate, the question what this crisis does to our political systems. The proposition that I would like my guests to respond to is the following. Corona creates new forms of authoritarianism, especially in liberal states. Now, Susan Neiman, maybe if I can go with you first. This, of course, would appear to be the worst case scenario, the worst possible outcome of this crisis, that we should all slide into authoritarian forms of politics. And of course, there is a great anxiety right now with all the freedoms that we are sort of willingly giving up. But would this necessarily, I mean, there is also a case to be made that as long as we are still within democratic frameworks of debate, we are still very much far away from authoritarian rules. What would your take on this question be?
So I think it's one of these unfortunate examples of self-fulfilling prophecies or attempted self-fulfilling prophecies. And I don't see any evidence for it at all, with the possible exception, well, with the exception of Viktor Orban, seems to me to be the main argument for it. Interestingly enough, the countries that have done the best in responding to the virus have largely been democracies, right? I mean, we have New Zealand, we have Taiwan, we have South Korea, and we have the Bundesrepublik Deutschland, which is doing extremely well. And I must say, I mean, so far, you know, all of us are worried that it's not going to last. I get quite annoyed at the protests. In the United States, they're absolutely crazy. Here, they're both smaller and less crazy, but people are worried about limiting democratic freedoms. I don't see, you know, I think that's a hysterical reaction to what's, you know, a reasonable concern for people's safety. And in those democratic, sorry, wait a sec, in those countries where you have both a democracy and a fairly high level of trust in the government, you actually see people, you know, there are very huge percentages of people being perfectly happy to go along with the restrictions. The other thing that disproves the claim that the coronavirus is going to support more authoritarianism is what's happening in the United States. Now, we have, unfortunately, a horrifically, you know, a wannabe authoritarian, or you know, somebody who admires the very worst authoritarian governments that are running the country. But he's completely ineffective. Now, this is about his own incompetence and many other things, but you see that Americans are putting their trust quite rightly in local governments, which are functioning democratically. So it's governors and mayors in some case who have actually taken over the business of running the show. So I don't see a lot of evidence for the claim. I understand that there's a worry, but I don't see much evidence for it. But I think Ivan disagrees with this. So.
Yes, I am afraid that Ivan might disagree. At least 1.5 months ago, you did publish in the European Council of Foreign Affairs on the website 7 early lessons from the corona crisis. And 2 of the points that you did make were that there would be a return of big government, which is not necessarily authoritarianism, and the appeal of big data authoritarianism is one of the dangers that you saw. Could you elaborate on that point a little bit? Or is that still what you see?
So where Susan is totally right is we're very early in this crisis, because this crisis also is going to change its face. Now, basically, we see a crisis which is mainly a public health crisis. But this crisis also is going to turn into economic crisis, and it's quite important.
I'm afraid we've lost Ivan for a second there to internet connections.
This was our worry.
This was our worry. Let's wait for 1 second, otherwise we will have to continue among ourselves.
Oh no, that's... Can we call him? Do we have a telephone number? I mean, if worse comes to worse, we could try WhatsApp. Because it's not interesting if we don't get to disagree with each other.
I think that we should just wait for a moment, and maybe we can talk about 1 or 2 more things until his connection comes back online. We could maybe hope for that. I was interested in the point that, if I may continue with you, I was very interested in the point you were making about trust in governments, because this seems to be, in my limited observation, the major difference of how people experience the democratic dangers or not dangers of this crisis. People in Germany seem to have, by and large, in the last 1 or 2 months, have expressed a lot of trust in the German democratic system, but also in the people who are ruling us. Notably, Chancellor Merkel has been seen as a very trustworthy person. And what you now said about the United States is sort of the evil counter-example of Donald Trump, who doesn't elicit trust in a lot of people, but you have then brought it down to this more local level where people will do everything that is needed to be done and will trust their government on a local sort of state level.
The governors have taken over,
Yes, so basically the criterion for functioning democracy at this moment would be trust.
Yeah, but what that means is, I mean, trust needs to be founded. That is, there has to be a history of people feeling that by and large, the government is not acting against their interests or for a small group of special interests, and that by and large, the government has been reasonably transparent in, conveying information. And, the fact is that is the case in Germany, where, by the way, I think one of the very few good pieces of good news to come out of the coronavirus crisis in Germany is that the AfD, which was trying very hard for the last 5 years to stir up mistrust against the government and against the traditional media, that the AfD has sunk in the polls dramatically, which is fantastic news. So anyway, that is, trust has to be earned. A government has to be trustworthy. If there's a history, by and large, in a democracy, people will come to trust it. Not always, of course, but by and large.
And would you connect this trust in government also in a sort of a common or shared rationality, something like a trust in reasonable debate or also a trust in science? Because one observation that has been interesting is how much experts have become authorities again. We have gone through long years of expertise and scientists being deviled, quite frankly. Climate change is a hoax. There's been a lot of conspiracy theories and a lot of mistrust in science. People believe that science, because it doesn't give full and complete answers to any given problem, is just as valid as what everybody else thinks. And now we are watching in real time how scientists don't understand the problem completely, but they do understand more than we do. And it would appear that trust in sort of authority of expertise or science or scientist has been, in a way, strengthened by this crisis.
Yeah, I think it's become clear that while they're also tapping in the dark, we don't have an alternative. It looks to me like Ivan has been unfrozen. Is that true? Can you hear? Can you hear
Yes,
us?
I'm back.
Oh, wonderful. Should we
I'm
go
back from the
to
dark authoritarian.
Do you remember the proposition that I would have liked to had your input on, and would you like to continue?
Yeah, I don't know what I managed to say before I was disrupted, but listen, if you go to literature and you look for a major metaphor for societies losing freedom, you're going to see all these books about plagues, about epidemics, and the major story is that all this kind of a viruses has one additional virus, and this is the infecting society with fear. And I do believe this is one of the important kind of a source of trouble. And the story is that if you ask people, and psychologists have been doing quite a lot of work on this, out of all threats people are facing, when they ask, are you ready to restrict your rights, to allow the government to restrict your rights, public health comes number one. People are not going to allow certain type of restriction of rights when it comes to the anti-terrorist legislation. But they're going to be much more open to this option when basically it comes to the problem of public health. So from this point of view, I do believe that these fears of kind of authoritarian shifts are natural, but there are two things on which I very much agree with Susan and I want to make clear. One is, this is not true that authoritarian leaders like crises like this. And the reason is very simple. Authoritarian leaders like crises that they can produce themselves.
Right.
Because basically this is a crisis which you can manage, which you can change. And this is not by accident that authoritarian leaders like Bolsonaro or Lukashenko, one of the major kind of political figures who said COVID-19 does not exist. This is manipulation. This is just in the imagination, because this crisis is real. And not simply
well,
that this
Trump
crisis
tried
is
to
real,
say that.
Yeah, this was before he decided to inject disinfectant, basically.
Right, but I'm just saying he fits the pattern you're talking about. He
So
tried.
exactly, and this is very important because in a certain way, the real crisis is also constrained. And this is one of the paradoxes of this crisis. Because it happens everywhere, we are sitting in different places. but we're all the time comparing what the governments are doing in different countries. You cannot isolate yourself. Paradoxically, the more people are isolated, the more, in a way, they're connected in the way they see the world, because staying here in a small village in Bulgaria, every day, even on Bulgaria television, I know how many people has died in the world, how many in the United States, what is happening in South Korea.
Right.
We are living in a time in which you don't need to know foreign language in order to understand the
Right.
news covered all over the world. And I don't believe that authoritarians like this. But what is a problem, and I see there's a major problem, is if this problem of social distancing is going to stay for a long time, forget about surveillance, forget about apps and so on, but democracy cannot function in a society in which more than 50 people cannot meet.
Yeah.
This is extremely important, because all these kind of crowds, all these rallies, this is also a very important form of representation, and not representation of interest, but representation of passions, of intensity. The trick of democracy is that you who care and I who do not care has one vote, both of us. So in order to tell me how much you care, you should be on the street. And I'm much more afraid that if we're going to have 2, 3, 4 years in which people are afraid to go next to each other, when you are not going to have more than 50 or 100 people around, then we're going to have a crisis. But of course, this crisis is not coming out of the fact that authoritarian regimes are performing better with respect to the coronavirus than the democratic regimes.
Just to go directly in this direction that you took now with your last point, you have at times talked about individualization in Western societies, such as has been the consequence of the 60s and 70s, the counterculture movement, as a problem for politics in the sense that it makes people less interested maybe in sort of groupthink, in collective enterprises. Now, there is the point that you just made now, people can no longer collectively represent their passions, but on the other hand, we are very much living this crisis as a collective experience, because we are all in it together, and whatever we don't do just for ourselves but for others. There is a sort of a very much a collective element to this, at least on the sort of a communal or national level. So wouldn't, in a way, this crisis lead to a sort of a stronger aptitude to political debate or to sort of a political identification in your theory?
Listen, in my view, the interesting story about this crisis is that it has two faces all the time that does not go each other. On one level, obviously, this crisis has a very strong deglobalization effect. You see the disruptions of the major, for example, supply chains. You are seeing countries closing their borders. At the same time, these same people, all of us, staying exiled in our apartments, we feel more than ever part of a common world, because the world is common. So paradoxically, the virus is the one that brought us together. But from these two faces, in my view, and these two trends are going to fight each other for a long period of time, because the German foreign minister was right that there is a type of a collective response, and I do believe that President Steinmeier, starting with his article in FT some weeks ago, started all this. But you have the two major powers in the world, United States and China, who are not part of it. So paradoxically, you're not going to see, I mean, before the elections, probably, this can change in November. But in this critical, compare with the global financial crisis, weeks after the global financial crisis, you have G20, you have certain kind of a common actions. I don't believe that even after the American elections, the relations between the United States and China is going to go cooperative. And you can also see how aggressively China basically is using this crisis to try to push its interest and role. So we are going to come with the world which is common, because we have been united by this virus. But at the same time, it's going to be much more confrontational, at least on the level of the two major global powers.
I think that you wanted to respond directly, Susan?
Maybe not yet. I mean, did you have a question?
No, I was interested in the, I mean, it's the different levels, right, of cooperation. I mean, we have the problem already on the level of the European Union, you could say, and of course also on the level of the American-European partnership and of the sort of much more global level of America and China. The question is, on which level does the pandemic, which theoretically should make us all cooperate, actually lead us to cooperate, right?
Well, I think Ivan is absolutely right in exposing this very paradoxical face of the crisis, that on the one hand, and you can express in a lot of different ways, you know, but we're deeply aware of and feeling globally connected at the same time that we've literally and physically retreated into the smallest possible space, our own homes. On the other hand, I think that, you know, I worry about making predictions because we are at a moment when really almost anything is possible. Think about the ways in which our behavior has changed within 2 months in ways that nobody predicted would have happened. I mean, we're all still getting used to a completely different form of living, of planning, of managing expectations. You know, I'm not sure that anybody has really come to terms with that yet. One of the things that means, though, is that we have absolutely open space in terms of possibilities. Neither of us are economists, and you know, I'm not sure how much we want to talk about nitty-gritty economic issues, but it's important to remember that the Great Depression produced in Germany, you know, played a huge role in feeding the rise of fascism. And the United States went in exactly the opposite direction. It produced Roosevelt's New Deal. And moreover, this is something that progressive Americans are thinking about and focusing on right now. I just was reading an article this afternoon. One would have predicted in 1931-32 that because of the huge amount of unemployment in the United States, that people would be able to suppress unions, you know, that anybody who was lucky enough to get a job wasn't going to be concerned about collective bargaining. In fact, it was the high point of labor activism in the United States, okay? And what we're seeing is the beginning of a renewed labor activism in the United States in major companies like Amazon, as people realize how terribly dependent we are on a class of workers who, you know, not only are paid less than the rest of us non-essentials, but, you know, have very little respect in the society, very little, you know, status. And it is open. I mean, I'm not saying this is going to happen. I don't make predictions on principle, but it is actually open that this could lead in a very progressive direction. Now, I mean, I can say more about that later on because you've sort of organized the you know, the discussion to 3 parts. But I think it's very important that we acknowledge the openness of possibility in this moment.
Yes, I think we will have to get back to these possibilities maybe a bit later in the discussion. I would like to just maybe one last point on this sort of question of the political landscape changing. There could be I mean, in a way, both those options that you gave us now, we could have the New Deal or we could have the rise of the far right. They both fall in a way under one of the points that you made, Ivan, in your early sort of lessons from the coronavirus, that is the strengthening of nationalism, because there is sort of whatever we see right now, we do see strong states and national states dealing with the problem on a primary level in their own healthcare systems, in their own sort of borders. And my question to you would be, would this also be an option of thinking about nationalism in a productive way beyond the sort of left-right question? Could nationalism also have a sort of a positive or productive input into our societies. I know that you have sort of you have not predicted the end of the European Union, but you are open to the possibility of it, if I understand you correctly. Oops. I'm afraid Ivan is...
Oh no, have we lost Ivan again?
Oh dear.
Shoot.
Well, I'm afraid we'll have to wait till he's back on.
Is it possible to try and get him by phone?
I am not sure. I think our technical crew is working on it right now.
Because if this is going to happen again...
Yeah, it might happen again, but we will have to... we'll cover for him as a... I mean...
Okay.
I'm not sure if this is something you're interested in talking about, but the question of what this does to sort of transnational organizations like the European Union is an interesting one, because we do find ourselves very much sort of falling back onto a default position of each state to itself. And there is some worry as what this might do to sort of the broader European ideal.
Yeah, of course I'm worried about that. I was born in America and socialized as an American, but I actually the day after Donald Trump was elected, I became a European. Or I went through the process of getting German citizenship. So I'm very committed to the idea of Europe. Ooh, there's Ivan. Whoops, there's Ivan.
You know, some are better connected than others.
Anyway, I am worried about it, but I don't see it. I thought what the foreign minister said, Maas said, was also quite reasonable, that there is a reasonable tendency, you know, as one does, to pay attention to the smaller circle that one can do something about and solidify before one goes forward. But Ivan has written a lot about this, so why don't we let him talk about the terrible things this is going to do to the EU.
Just two things which I found quite important is that on one level, and you started with this, you have a crisis that radicalized the imagination of everybody. The imagination of the left, the imagination of the right. Imagine if you're a climate activist and you have been hoping that one day the planes are going to be landed. You hope for this, but you never believed in it. And then overnight, do you know that between February and March, the flights in Europe has decreased 97%. So suddenly, your radical utopia is here. And then if you're a radical nationalist, you always hoped that all the borders between the EU member states are going to be closed, but you never believe this is going to happen, and overnight it happens. So one of the important things is that it radicalized the imagination of everybody, not of the left only and not of the right only. But for me, there is one important difference between the type of nationalism that we see in this crisis, and I do believe we see it, and to be honest, Germany was also part of it in the first week, and the type of nationalism that we saw during the refugee crisis. The refugee crisis, it was particularly ethnic. It is about origins. It was a cultural war. This one is territorial. For example, in Bulgaria, the major distinctions was not between those born of Bulgarians and others, it was between those who are in the country and those who are outside of the country. And this is quite important because all those who are inside of the country, they have been treated as being part of it because you depend on them, because you cannot allow them to function differently. So this territorial nationalism is more inclusive than the ethnic nationalism of the refugee crisis. And in my view, this is also one of my fear, because what we are seeing today very much resembles the return of the three previous crises that we have in the last 10 years. You look at the closing of the European borders and you said, okay, the refugee crisis all over again. Then you look basically about all this restrictive rights legislation and you see war on terror all over again. Mm-hmm. And then you look at the financial crisis and all the talk about Corona bonds and so on, and just say the financial crisis all over again. For me, and I very much agree with Susan that football was to predict particularly the future, but it is also quite important to know that we see a different crisis. It's a novel crisis. It is not simply the return of the previous three. And for me, this is something that is important.
I couldn't agree with you more, exactly.
Well, this is also a good moment to move on to our second block, our second topic of debate tonight, which is the effects on culture and society that Corona will have. And the thesis that we will use to introduce this part is actually a direct quote from an interview that Ivan Krastev did with the German newspaper Die Zeit. It says, "The current crisis is also a metaphysical crisis, but we don't discuss this enough." Now, as long as we have you in the line, Ivan, maybe you could elaborate on this a little bit?
I hope. Listen, when we touch on metaphysics, I'm sure that the connection is going to stay, because this is also Susan's round. But in my view, at least for me, there are two important issues. One is our relations to death, and this is critically important, because one of the strange stories that basically is that we're seeing death as, for example, somebody who is hungry to medical mistake or did something else happen. From this point of view, you see this virus, this is killing most, is nothing dramatic. It is dramatic, and for good reasons, because I do believe our relations to death has been changed. And this is also why I do believe people has a huge problem with epidemics, because the death does not have any meaning. A war, at least the guy that you are not dying, you are sacrificing. There is a dying random. There is no meaning in what is happening. And I do believe this is one of the scary factors of all these epidemics. I was very much, by the way, shocked by a fact which, you know, people has died than the World War I. But Spanish, there are only 400 books that have been written for the last 100 years on the Spanish flu, and there are 80,000 on the World War I. And one of the reasons is that we don't know how to remember these epidemics, because at a certain point, nothing is happening. I always that the difference between the epidemics and the war, this is the difference in reading Tolstoy's War and Peace and reading Joyce, because it's a stream of consciousness. Everything is happening in our imagination. Stay confined, imagine difference. But if you're going to ask me what I did for the last 50 days, staying confined here, there is not many things that happened. And when we talk about this, how we are producing the meaning of life, for me, the interesting story is kind of a narrative can come also out of this.
I do apologize for the bad connection. Susan, the question of meaning and natural catastrophes versus man-made one, this does very much go to the heart of things that are very close to your work, especially, I mean, this is not classically, philosophically speaking, a metaphysical evil, a pandemic. It is, in classical philosophy, it would be a natural evil. But what is the status of a natural evil? Does it have meaning? Do we have to give it meaning, or do we just have to go through it?
So thank you for your kind words about my book, Evil in Modern Thought. I just want to add something. You said I talk about the dark sides of the Enlightenment, and it's true that I do that, but it's not because I simply have, have a weakness for pointing out dark sides of things. There are people who do that. The reason that I wanted to point out the dark sides of the Enlightenment was exactly to show that the Enlightenment was far from the sort of naively optimistic movement that people tend to take it to be, and to show that, yes, actually, they thought a lot about evil. In fact, they spent probably as much time thinking about the nature of evil as anything else. So when they talk about hope and the possibility of progress, it's not because, you know, they're clueless children, which is often how they're portrayed, but that to be the side. And one of the things that they did, which was extremely progressive and extremely modern, was to distinguish between natural, moral, and metaphysical evil. Metaphysical evil kind of fell out the window, but the important thing was to distinguish between things like plagues and earthquakes, which had been taken as natural evil, and things like wars and murder, which were called moral evil, but natural evil was always seen as punishment for moral evil, and God was responsible for all of it. And something changed so all of it had meaning. That is, natural evil had a meaning. Of course you're suffering. You screwed up in some terrible way, and maybe you don't know what it is, but God knew what it was. I mean, this is, you know, goes all the way back to the book of Job, where his three friends come and tell him, no, actually, he must have done something wrong, otherwise he wouldn't be suffering. And it's a very, even in modern times, it's a very natural assumption. I mean, this is one reason why we're also celebrating the Jean Amery Prize winner, and Jean Amery is one of my heroes. So in fact, we were supposed to do a conference on Jean Amery at the Einstein Forum at the end of June, but we're putting that off for a year. Jean Amery talks in one of his most famous essays about the fact that people like him who were neither religious nor members of the Communist Party had a much harder time surviving Auschwitz, because and part of it, and there have been studies about this as well, they could give no meaning to the suffering that they were going through. They had no way of understanding what they were being, as it were, punished for. So, but anyway, this was it was a deep connection between natural and moral evil until 1755, when an earthquake destroyed Lisbon, at that point one of the richest and largest cities of Europe. And philosophers like Voltaire and Kant, and then later Rousseau, began asking, wait, was Lisbon worse than London or Paris? Were there more sinners in Lisbon? Why did it happen there, not here? And in consequence of that, not just the earthquake, but the fact that people in the Enlightenment were thinking about it, the decision was made to say, okay, earthquakes and plagues we're not going to call them evil anymore. We're going to call them natural catastrophes. They have no meaning whatsoever. They're not coming along to punish people. They're just a glitch in the machinery. And let's focus on the things we can do something about, like wars and torture. And it seemed like a very progressive distinction. I think, to go back to what Ivan was saying about the number of books written about the Spanish flu, I think it comes from this sense that, you know, plagues have no meaning. What is there to, you know, you've divested them of any kind of theological or moral meaning, and so there's nothing to say about them. But I think in just one more, or a sentence and a half more, I think the distinction between natural and moral evils started to break down again with climate change. And we don't know enough about the origins of the coronavirus yet, and to what extent it can be connected to the ways in which we've been screwing up the earth. But my sense is the distinction between moral and natural evil doesn't make sense anymore. We're too involved with each other, and that is what the term Anthropocene means. Sorry, I went on for such a long time, Catherine, but you did ask me.
Please.
Can just make one point because it was extremely interesting. But this is part of the problem, exactly because people cannot accept the fact that there is no meaning. And they're going to find meaning. And the conspiracy theory is about this. When the President Trump is saying that it is a Chinese virus, it is a meaning because it's a part of the global competition between the United States and China. When the Chinese start with their conspiracy theory that probably this is a special CIA operation, it gives meaning. So from this point of view, while philosophers can make a distinction, ordinary people are not doing the distinction. And I do believe this is going to be one of the stories. And when you go to the climate change also, there is one interesting kind of a twist here. And this is on the generational level. If you see the debate on the climate change, it's mainly young people going to the older generation and said, listen, what you did to us. You have been living your life, which makes us vulnerable. You hurt the earth. With now the COVID-19, it changes. Old people go to young people and said, please stay home. By going easily back to your normal way of life, you're exposing us because we are more vulnerable. So generationally, it appears that two different generations feel more vulnerable in these two different crises.
Actually, Ivan, I've got to challenge you on that because there's anecdotal evidence, and the most shared article in the New Yorker for weeks was a story about young people in their 30s trying to convince their parents in their 60s and 70s who are still working and still traveling and don't think of themselves as belonging to a risk group, trying to convince their parents to stay home and stop going around. And I know a number of cases where actually children have been more concerned about their parents who are, have just moved into this risk group than normal.
This is about your parents. It's about your parents. But one of the interesting stories, it's not about your parents, it's about old people in general. And very obvious reasons, also some economic ones. In Bulgaria, we have this huge debate about people who say cost is too high and should start basically a normal job. And then basically, all the people who said, don't do this to us.
I'm afraid that we missed a part there in the middle about what I didn't get the last point you were making. There was a connection problem.
Yeah, I'm saying that for sure, when it is within the family, the young people are very much careful about what is happening to their parents. The problem is when you go in a society as a whole. And then, for example, it's interesting, by the way, at least what I see in Bulgaria is that because of this crisis, suddenly, some people decided that they're old. And the same people on basically the same age decided that they are not. And this kind of a problem of age comes interestingly. And this very much defines reactions. This defines sensitivity towards governmental policies, particularly when we should get exit out of the lockdown.
Even I'm not sure that it's only confined to people's families. My neighborhood here in Neukölln and Kreuzberg is plastered full of little notices of people saying, are you over 65? Would you like us to go to the post office for you or collect your groceries? I mean, there are all of these initiatives in younger people helping older people. I was just reading about something like that in Wuhan. So it's not confined. I think it's quite international.
But I do think, to Ivan's point, from anecdotal evidence, what has the thing that happens between children and parents is that it is now children who tell their parents, please stay at home. There is this complete role reversal of the teenager with his parents. This seems to be quite universal. I mean, you will help other old people, but you will tell your own parents to please stay at home. I think that might be the difference. But I think we have to get to our last topic, our third topic of conversation, about the future after the corona crisis, and this one is generally sort of the topic of the crisis on norms and orders, and we are already deep in this because we've already spoken about the generational problems, and Susan has also mentioned the question of essential work, which is important. The proposition that we put at the head of this part is the following. Corona invites us to rethink even fundamental social norms and orders. And as we said, an example would be the generational contract. I think we could widen it probably to the question of what happens to parents of young children. I mean, there's not just the middle-aged people and the old people, there's also the children who are in a very specific way suffering from this crisis. But I think the other thing that Susan already talked about earlier on is the question of who is actually essential for our society. What is essential work? Who are essential workers? And this has been a dominating and towering topic of debate in the last 2 months, since we noticed that we can stay at home, but other people cannot. So, Susan Neiman, if you would maybe elaborate on the points, what you see as the important points, and also as the possibilities of outcome of this crisis.
So, best case, again, and this is a kind of Kantian point, I think we have, in a situation where the outcome is absolutely unknown, I think we have a moral obligation to hope for the better outcome in order to allow us to work towards a better outcome. Not in order to do wish fulfillment or fantasy, but if we don't believe that the better of two outcomes is possible, we will resign and become cynical and give up. And the best outcome is this. What the coronavirus has made clear is that the moral distinction between self-interested behavior and other-directed behavior or generous behavior, that distinction makes no sense anymore. We've been living for at least 30 years since the so-called end of history and the triumph of neoliberalism with the belief that people are really only motivated by a very narrow form of self-interest. And it's a deep ideology that's not just reinforced by economic neoliberalism, it's reinforced by evolutionary psychology, and it's even reinforced by certain parts of postmodernist truth is power theory. But I think it's undeniable that that's been the tenor of the times for the last 30 years. And that it's felt very hard for people like me, who writes books with names like Moral Clarity and talks about the reality of ideals. It's been very hard for me not to get laughed at, as somebody who's, just hopelessly naive and idealistic. Well, guess what? It turns out that radically self-interested behavior, now that we have seen how deeply connected we all are, turns out not to be possible. We need we need the people who check out groceries at the store more than most of us, frankly, and we need to take care of each other. Not out of goodwill, not out of generosity, not out of being a social democrat, which I am, but simply because everything will collapse if we don't. And I think the chance of moving forward on a lot of projects that needed to happen, even mentioned, the climate change activists' wet dream. People, even if they admired Greta Thunberg half a year ago, they thought it was pretty funny her traveling in a boat. Now you can't get an airplane from most places to most places. So, we've suddenly seen these radical changes in behavior, but we've also seen that we are deeply dependent on each other. And it seems to me that a switch in thinking about that could really open up new norms, or a situation in which the clash between norms and self-interest just seems utterly ridiculous.
So, yeah, just on this, because Susan has this beautiful phrase in her book, Learning from the Germans, that enlightenment is a tough business. And just to give an illustration, when you see that certain job is very essential for you, if you're in business, the first thing that you want to do is to automate it. If it's very essential, better to be performed by robots because they don't get sick. And I do believe that one of the outcomes of this crisis is going to be a real strong push for automation. And when you're basically reading and seeing what businesses are doing, this is important. Because this type of a total uncertainty, which Susan was talking about, also creates the situation in which the government starts working with the worst case scenario. In a certain way, you're so much in a situation in which you don't know what to do. Your actions basically are based on nothing, particularly in the beginning. You don't know what kind of virus. You don't have any type of testing. So this is why countries are locking down, even don't knowing why they're doing this. By the way, in a country like Bulgaria, we have 60 people that have died for the last 1 month. And we basically have the same lockdown like everywhere else. And this is the politics of uncertainty. You are doing what others are doing because this is the only way to tell to your people, listen, I don't know what is going on, but you cannot accuse me of not doing what others that have a real problem is doing. So from this point of view, yes, the radicalization of the imagination can lead to a much more normative vision, but it can also go very much to this defensive position. And from this point of view, if you look at the last 2 months, imagine that all of us are sitting here and we are going to be offered to have a referendum. Which crisis is going to be best for humanities? Is it a war or a kind of a big migration or pandemic? And believe me, I do believe most of us were going to have a pandemic. Unlike the wars, it's not basically clashing nations against each other. It's less pressure on the democratic regimes. And then you have this pandemic and the capacity for the international community to react cooperatively for the last 2 months was really at a very low level. So from this point of view, I do believe that they could be also a breaking point in which, out of not knowing what we are doing, in the way we closed our borders, we're also going to close our imagination. Because you said the loot is so kind of risky that the best thing that we should do is to go back to the normal, even if we don't know that the normal exists.
Ivan, I have a question for you because I've started actually to collect things in a file that I call Corona Good News. Collect in the things that I'm reading, actually examples of people opening their imagination. And I'm getting quite a number of things in the English-speaking press, but you read other languages than I read. So what are you seeing people's imagination closing, or are you seeing people, I mean, like the discussion in the US, which has just an abysmal level of labor activism and, basically no worker protection. Suddenly people are talking about, serious unionization in ways that hasn't been done since the 1930s. That's one example, but there are other things going on as well. What's your empirical
No, listen, none of us has a really empirical views on anything because all of us are staying in our houses and our basically empirics is the last thing that we did. But I do believe that what is happening is that those groups that have a strong normative vision, by the way, both on the left and on the right, are the only one that you can hear. Either you can see these people protesting against the lockdowns in the United States and saying the social distancing is equal to communism. Or on the other side, you're going to see the left activists. My major story, and this is why I was so fascinated by the fact that we don't remember epidemics. The interesting story is that we can have our life being changed, but not in a deliberative way. There is not a project for change. Much more the epidemics is going to change our lives because of other things happening as a side effects of this and that, instead of one or the other project being realized. And to be honest, this was also one of the major effects of the Black Deaths during the Middle Ages, because so many people had been killed. There was a basically deficit of labor, And as a result of this, a classical feudal society was very much destabilized, and you have higher wages and others. But Susan, you said it in the beginning. 1930s happened in the United States, and you have Roosevelt, and they basically happened in Germany, and they had Hitler. In both places, it could have been different. So from this point
Right.
of view, I don't believe that there is a certain direction which this crisis is pushing us for. It's going to be many things depending on decision of political leaders, but also on luck. And this is one of the things that in, for example, Bulgaria, when you're asking people, we are doing fine, we have not many infected people, we don't have many people dying, does it mean that we are doing very well? And many of the people are going to say, we are lucky.
Very interesting.
I'd just like to add one thing. Yes, it's going to depend on, I mean, I agree with you entirely that it could go either way. And of course, it could go very, very wrong. It could accelerate the worst tendencies that we have all been worrying about for the last few years. But it isn't just luck, and it isn't just politicians. It's also a question of what people decide to do about it. And I share your worry that a real democracy is definitely hindered if no more than 50 people can get on the streets together. But you did see, I suppose, the pictures of the demonstration in Israel where people were carefully marked out in Tel Aviv, you know, I mean, 2 meters apart from each other. I mean, people are imagining new forms of political activity as well.
So I would say that is obviously the great challenge, because of course I do see this point with a lot of things are luck. Many countries are luckier than others in where they caught the pandemic. But I do think that there might be a point to be made for a political outcome to also have something to do with political actions that we might choose or not to take. And of course, I did get your point. The point was made repeatedly this evening that there might be a certain difficulty in doing that when we are all sitting at home in isolation and the communication is at best wobbly through the internet. And this has been the experience of tonight, but it has been a great experience, and I'm afraid we will have to wrap it up now because we are already a little bit over time. But thank you both so much for debating these topics with me. Thank you, Susan Neiman from Neukölln. And thank you, Ivan Krastev from the south of Bulgaria. And of course, I would also like to thank our audience who has stuck with us online. And this debate will continue to be available online in German and English. And we will also continue this format. We will be doing 3 more discussions of the Berliner Korrespondenzen in the virtual realm until the summer on the various effects and challenges and possibly political chances or sort of opportunities of the corona crisis. I want to lastly thank the technical team of the Gorky Theatre for making this all happen despite some little glitches. I want to thank the translators and everyone who was involved in the preparation from the Allianz Kulturstiftung. So thank you very much, Susan. Thank you, Ivan. I hope that you stay safe, that you stay healthy. Thank you to all the audience for your attention. Good night, good luck. Keep at home, keep healthy, and keep safe. Goodbye.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.